So I welcome you all to this meeting. People are still drifting in. I welcome those who are here with us and those who are on the other side of the camera, because we are on a live stream to Turkey, to Europe, and to other places in the world. And this will be seen by many people, I can assure you. Now, we who are here have just returned from Turkey on a fact-finding mission on human rights. This is Denis O'Hearn. He is a professor of sociology at El Paso University in Texas. He is a specialist on prisons, prison law in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Turkey. Not to forget Ireland, he followed the imprisonment of IRA people in the 1980s and 1990s and made extensive research on this. He wrote a biography of Bobby Sands, who led the hunger strikes in 1980 and 1981, where 10 people were eventually lost their lives. So he is well acquainted with this, and he has been in Turkey before this mission and has done extensive research on the situation. Now, Laura Castel is a senator from Spain, and she is also a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and she is the vice chair of the United Left in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. I, who was the third person on the mission, have a background in trade unionism and Icelandic politics, was a member of parliament. Now, there at the end of the table is Havin Guneser. I don't know what she is not. She is a journalist, she is a campaigner for women's rights, she is a translator, but last but not least, she is the spokesman, or one of the spokespersons, for the international initiative Freedom for Abdullah Öcalan, Peace in Kurdistan. And I might add that I also have the honor of being such a spokesman, and I've been so for several years. And I've been on a mission like the one we have just completed several times to Turkey, five times or 6 times now altogether, 3 times in Turkey, 4 times in Turkey, and then during COVID we were on the internet. Now, why Abdullah Öcalan and Imrali, which is here on the screen? This is a prison island in the Marmara Sea, just off the coast of Istanbul. And in that prison, Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the Kurds, has been in isolation since 1999, for almost quarter of a century, for 24 years, since January 1999. He was abducted on his way to South Africa after being rejected by several NATO countries for asylum when he was forced out of Syria. He was abducted in Kenya on his way to South Africa at the invitation of Nelson Mandela, who we know sat in prison on Robben Island for 27 years before he was released, and we know what happened in the wake of that. And this is what people are expecting when finally the prison doors are opened in Imrali prison. And it is our belief that the key to peace in Turkey, that we can finish the war that has been going on for a long time between the Kurds and the Turkish authorities, which have been systematically attacking the Kurds for decades. Now, why do I say this with such confidence, that the key is in Imrali prison? We have the evidence from history. Between 2013 and 2015, the doors, or the windows rather, of Imrali prison were opened for a while. And Abdullah Öcalan was allowed to take part in negotiations with the Turkish authorities. And it is told to me, and I partly have experienced this myself, that in this period there was hope in the air. There was hope in the air. I remember, I can tell you a little experience of my own. I was in Diyarbakir in southeastern Turkey, in Kurdistan, in 2014, and I was present at a big rally. And there were messages amongst them from Abdullah Öcalan, and I thought it sounded all rather violent. And then it was translated to me, and it was all about peace. Let us have the courage to make peace, to negotiate peace. And it is these words and this message which is imprisoned, or are imprisoned, in Imrali Island. This is why we say the key to peace, the key to a peaceful future, is in Imrali Island. Now, I said 2013, 2015. What happened after 2015? Then the prison cells were shut again. And the atrocities began. And I ask you, have you seen these pictures? Have you seen these pictures? They have not been on the media in our part of the world, and in no part of the world, I believe. But these are from inside Turkey, and show us Turkish cities, towns, villages being attacked and razed to the ground by the Turkish army. These pictures, most of them are from 2015, 2016, and some from 2017. And some of the pictures you will see are reminiscent of what is happening now in the mountains in eastern Turkey, on the borders with Iraq, and also in Syria, of course, where daily there are attacks. There are drone attacks and there are other attacks. Chemical weapons are alleged to be used. And this is all from there. We haven't seen this on our media, have we? The world is not seeing this. But this is inside Turkey. This is what the Turkish authorities are doing to their own people. Do you know where this is from? This is from Ahmed. This is from Sur, the old city, the old part of Ahmed. Ahmed has thousands of years of history. It has been habitation there since the Stone Age. And this was one of the centers of Mesopotamia. The United Nations declared Sur a cultural heritage. I think it was in 2014 or 2015. And when it was erased, 80% of it, not a word from the international community, not a single word. I never heard anything. Again, inside Turkey. At that time, Amnesty International said that there were at least 500,000 people, if not more, who had been forced from their homes. This is in the mountains. This is what is happening there now. last picture I am showing you could be any of us. But we are here in safety, something that cannot be said of these people. And this is why we are grateful that you come and show interest in knowing about this and showing solidarity with those who are being oppressed. Now, this can be seen, but what cannot be seen is what is happening in the prisons, within the prisons. And this is what Denis O'Hearn is going to tell us. He is going to tell us about the Turkish prison system in the context of other research he has carried out.
Thank you, Ögmundur, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm very happy to be here today, although the subject is somewhat less than happy. First of all, the treatment of Abdullah Öcalan and İmralı has been a harbinger of the direction of Turkish society as a whole. It's not simply an isolated case. Since his imprisonment in 1999, we have seen that the isolated case of Öcalan is not by itself, but is part of what has become an imprisoned society, both in Kurdistan and the Kurdish regions of Turkey and in Turkey as a whole. We can see this quantitatively, and you see from your screen behind you that Turkish incarceration rates have risen dramatically since Erdogan came to power in the year 2003. So when he came to power, Turkey had only 75 persons per 100,000 of population. That was the incarceration rate in the country. It was one of the lowest incarceration rates in Europe, equal to Sweden and Switzerland, who we know are very low. And in those 20 years, just 20 years after that, and this has all been planned, you can see by the increase in the numbers, that 20 years later, 374 per 100,000 people are imprisoned in Turkey. That's 5 times the imprisonment rate of the year 2003. It's now the second highest rate within the OECD. You can see the small red line is actually Sweden, but that's where Turkey was 20 years ago. And now Turkey is the second highest, as you can see from this bar graph. Next only to the United States, which, as we know, is a real outlier in the levels of imprisonment. Not only that, Turkey has had the highest growth rate of prisoners during that period. I've met with Turkish prison officials and so on, and they've shown me the plans. This was in about 2013, that they were building enough prisons to double the number of people in prisons. This was a planned operation by the Turkish state. They have the highest number of political prisoners, although we don't really know how many political prisoners there are. They used to publish those figures, but they stopped publishing them, particularly after the so-called coup in 2016, in the state of exception. They no longer report a lot of the figures that they used to report. So we know it's a very high rate of political imprisonment and growing higher by the day, but we don't know just how high it is at the moment. And finally, they have the highest number of prisoners who have been in long-term confinement, 30 plus years. There are now more than 1,000 prisoners in the state of Turkey who have been in prison for more than 30 years. And that's one thing that we do know from various prison support organizations. This is a picture of the new kind of imprisonment which began in the year 2000, with the support, by the way, of the Committee for the Prevention of Torture, which came out and said that this was a better way of imprisoning people. It's a form of isolation which follows the US model of the supermax prison, in which people are put into prison in very isolated conditions. And I've put together this kind of layout of what the F-type prison looks like. Most of the prisoners are in 3-person cells. So the gray areas are the cells, the orange areas are the yards outside of the cells. And the only people that prisoners in the F-type prisons get to talk to, for the most part, are their two cellmates. We've been told by prisoners who inhabit these cells that the three-person layout is more or less on purpose, they believe, because when you put three people into a cell, it usually divides up two against one, and it's a form of creating a kind of internal enmity between the prisoners rather than solidarity. Even prisoners who are very much in solidarity with each other find it very difficult to live in those kinds of conditions. But we also know that in each of these prisons, these F-type prisons, of which I believe right now there are 13 of them throughout the state of Turkey, there are not only 103 of these three-prisoner cells, but there are 59 one-prisoner cells. And these one-prisoner cells, of course, violate the Mandela rules, which say that if you keep people in isolation without meaningful interaction with other human beings for more than 15 days, it is a form of torture. So we know that the Turkish government is basically practicing wide-scale torture throughout its prisons. And this is something which has particularly been growing since the Erdogan government came into power, although it began before him. So that's a little bit about the quantitative dimensions, but it's the qualitative dimensions as well, which are very important to understand. Turkish imprisonment since the year 2000 in a very violent operation called Return to Life. There's a lot of irony in the kind of verbiage that we hear from the Turkish government. In an operation called Return to Life, in which many prisoners died, they were moved from a ward-style, open dormitory style of imprisonment into these isolated F-type prisons. And during that period of time, then there was this kind of movement, really to the US regime, at least in the supermax prisons of the US, of isolated imprisonments of the prisoners, of political prisoners. In terms of Öcalan's imprisonment on İmralı, this is the extreme case, not only of isolation, but of incommunicado detention. And an extent that I haven't seen, and I've done a lot of research on prisons around the world, the only places I can actually compare to what's happening to Öcalan on İmralı is what's happening in the black sites, which the US, of course, keeps silent about and doesn't want us to know about. But Turkey is doing this in full view of the world, is keeping Öcalan in these kind of conditions. In 24 years, he's had only 2 telephone calls. From 2011 to 2019, he had only 5 lawyer visits. That's over 8 years. And since August of 2019, he has had no visits with his lawyers. From 2014 until now, he had only 5 family visits. And he's had no family visits since March of 2020. So for 3 years, no telephone, no lawyer, no family, no letters. Now, I've seen this in some other places for a short period of time as punishment, that your access to letters may be taken away, or your access to your family visits may be taken away, usually not lawyer visits. I have never seen this level across the board of all of these sanctions against a prisoner. And this is happening now. There are, I think, 3 other prisoners on İmralı with Öcalan. So it's really an extreme form, not just of isolation, but incommunicado. And it's happening in full sight of the world, although very few people know about it. So this is really an extreme version of isolation that we've seen really nowhere else in the world. But this is not the only thing which is going on, because this particular example of isolation is being spread throughout the prisons, through the building of the F-type prisons, which began in the year 2000, and now has risen. But now we have T-type prisons, U-type prisons. I think for every letter of the alphabet, they have a new kind of isolated imprisonment in Turkey. We've known a fair bit about it up until the 2015 election, in which the Kurds did too well, so they didn't want to talk very much about what was going on anymore. And of course, especially since the 2016 coup The mechanisms of punishment we hear have been rising since that time, and the data that we are able to have access to under the state of emergency has been falling. One of the very interesting things that we heard on our delegation over the past week, lawyers said, and this is a quote, "No one here feels the need to apply the law." There's been a rise in what is referred to as administrative detention, where the administrators of the prison, not the courts, not the law, but the administrators within the prisons increase sentences arbitrarily. So if you come to the end of a prisoner's sentence, and this is particularly true of Kurdish prisoners, if they come to the end of their sentence and they refuse to sign a statement of regret for what they did to get them into prison in the first place, which in many cases wasn't much, it was being Kurdish. It's kind of like the law against being black on the streets in America. There's a similar law against being Kurdish in Turkey. If they don't sign a statement of regret for their actions that got them into jail, they're given an extra sentence beyond the legal sentence that they were given by the courts. If they use too much water during their period of time, it is said that they have to pay back the water that they have consumed by spending more time in jail. If they didn't check out enough religious books from the prison library while they were in jail, they can have their term of imprisonment expanded. And there's also a distribution, we are told, between favored and non-favored prisoners. So in recent years, we've seen a lot of ex-military prisoners who went in because of the crimes they committed as members of the military being released. We've seen Sikh prisoners being released on humanitarian grounds. And in particular, we've seen the release of Hezbollah prisoners. And the Turkish Hezbollah is a fascist organization which carries out violent activities on behalf of the Turkish state. But this is not being extended to Kurdish prisoners, so a number of them remain in prison in spite of, for example, being very ill, terminally ill. So we're told in the last 2 years there has been an extreme rise in the number of suspicious deaths in Turkish prisons. In 2022 alone, 50 prisoners died in suspicious circumstances that we really can't account for. We're also told that this level of oppression and fear, and of course people always talked about a climate of fear. We heard that over and over and over again. There's a climate of fear here, is something which has extended beyond the prisons into society as a whole. So widespread repression of human rights groups, of students, of the press. One of the most well-known cases is the case of Osman Kavala, who is a head of a human rights organization who was put into jail in 2017 and has been there since. I know a number of students. Some of them were my students in the United States when I worked at the State University of New York, who have been put into prison for various kinds of trumped-up reasons. And perhaps the most disturbing was a series of academics who signed a petition for peace, were charged, and in some cases imprisoned, because they signed a petition for peace. Peace is terrorism in Turkey. It is something straight out of Orwell and something we don't expect to see in this day and age. But the idea of that supporting peace, and they were supporting the idea of a resumption of a peace process between the Kurds and the Turkish state. And this is seen as an act of terror by the state. Finally, European and UN bodies have really failed Turkey, and we heard a number of occasions where these bodies have maybe done an investigation, have sent a report, asked, given the Turkish state the opportunity to respond to that report, but the report just sits there. And the Turkish state has come under no pressure to do their part and respond to the allegations that are made in these investigative reports. So this is really one of the most disturbing things, I think, is that outside bodies, and particularly the body that is meeting in Reykjavík today, have not done their job. And I just want to finally read some parts of a letter that I got from a Kurdish prisoner, Thailand. I think it's important that we say people's names. They want us to know their names. Thailand is serving more than 30 years in prison. He has cancer and continues to serve in prison. And he wrote to me, we were asking him questions about what prison life was like. And he says, in the West, the basic principle of the prison is defined as surveillance, to keep under observation, to mold the soul and behavior with the feeling of being under constant surveillance. But to me, the principle of prison here is different. In Eastern stories, the heroes either fall into or are thrown into a well. The well that Yusuf, was thrown into remains as a symbol of his brother's desire to kill him. In here, the objective is not to keep you under surveillance. Rather, it makes you invisible. It counts you as non-existent. It denies your existence and behaves as though you never existed. The objective here is not to see, but to bury. And as defenders of human rights, we must bring this into the light, especially on this occasion as the Council of Europe claims to be the continent's leading human rights organization. If so, it must live up to this claim and bring into the light the cases of those prisoners, including Abdullah Öcalan and my friend Tayla, who the Turkish state has attempted to bury. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Denis. And now, Laura Castel.
So first of all, thank you. Thank you for attending the results of our fact-finding mission. I am summarizing what we discovered, what the meetings, what they explained to us, the organizations we met. Because in our fact-finding mission, we met, the first meeting was with the ASRIM Law Office, the lawyers of Öcalan. And they told us that Öcalan, of course, is a unique case, and Denis has explained a lot. There are 20 years with no law and human rights in Turkey since the Imbrali process began. Currently, there has been no communications since 25 months. The lawyers and the family have no idea if he is well or not. All petitions and requests from the lawyers and family to visit him are declined. The last 8 years, Turkey is under security policy, totally polarized. The courts are criminalized. The isolation regime in Imrali has risen to a torture level, and the Turkish government is using Öcalan as a political weapon. No one is mentioning the human rights violations, the extreme isolation and the torture. The European Court of Human Rights, the Court of the Council of Europe, ruled against the aggravated life sentence in 2014, but in a decade, in 10 years, no application has happened. The CPT, the Organisms Against Torture of the Council of Europe, is normalizing the situation. The lawyers told us that between human rights and security, Europe always chooses security, and the violation of human rights committed in Turkey are ignored. They said to us a message to Council of Europe, which is, Öcalan can change the political environment in Turkey, that he is the key factor for resolution. Release Öcalan and sit and talk with him in order to negotiate a political solution and peaceful means, involving Öcalan. So there is no solution on Kurdish situation without Öcalan. After this meeting, we met HDK, the People's Democratic Congress, and they said to us that the terrorism law is used against the opposition. Even media, press, lawyers, members of parliament, all are targeted by the terrorism law. There is no pardoning, even for elderly inmates or ill inmates, no pardoning. They ask the Council of Europe to open a new peace process, a general amnesty, the application of the European Court of Human Rights decisions, release political prisoners, they say. We noted that every person who met affirmed that the fate of Kurdish people is connected with whatsoever happens to Öcalan. The third meeting was with OHD, the Lawyers for Freedom Association, and they share with us that the last 8 years have been a genocide approach, a cultural and political operation, and the rest of society are affected too. The punishments are more severe. The approach of the government is discipline the opposition by putting them in prisons. The judges are appointed by Erdogan because after the coup d'etat, Erdogan expelled the judges, the normal judges, and put AKP members instead as judges. In criminal cases, double standards are applied for Kurdish people. They create an environment of fear, arresting people indiscriminately, and the intelligence services are used for digging in the backgrounds of workers, accusing them of terrorism, and eventually expelled. They torture inside prisons, and then they offer ropes after tortures to incite the inmates to commit suicide. They say, prison or blood, or prison or death. It seems that the prisons regime in Turkey is a concentration camp regime. The conclusion is that Imdrali has been a laboratory of the worst practices afterward applied in the rest of prisons. After the meeting, we met the Saturday mothers, and they said to us that during the 80s military dictatorship, the forcible disappearances began. During the 90s, the police violence became systematic. The last years, 300 massacres have occurred, perpetrated by paramilitary groups, but also official police forces and Hezbollah members. And even though there are witnesses, including members of the military forces, and even though there are plenty of European Court of Human Rights rules, there is no one application. The rule is impunity and no punishment, and retaliation fear is spread if someone denounces. In 1995 started the protests of Saturday mothers in front of the Galatasaray High School. They are getting arrested every time they approach. They told us, the mothers, that very elderly and ill prisoners were not released, and there is no legal constraint for the government authorities, no transparency, no rights, no freedoms. We continue our fact-finding mission with a meeting with the women's movement, TJA, and they said that Öcalan is perceived as their leader. His perspective on feminism and leadership is paramount for them because his ideological perspective is liberation of women, their visibility in public space, and gender equality in representative politics. They say that Öcalan's vision is, and I quote, "Without women is no peace process. An isolation," and I finished the quote, "an isolation regime silences women as well." The state of exception was declared after peace process in 2015, and the harassment increased against women, and the isolation regime impacts on them too, because they have direct communication with Öcalan, and they lose it. Women movement associations were attacked by government, including female mayors, who were substituted by male trustees, violating the political rights. The last meeting, and I am concluding, was with Med Federation of Associations for Legal Aid and Solidarity with Families of Arrestees and Convicts, Med Tuhat. And they shared with us that the Kurdish political prisoners have different conditions. Turkish state violates internal and international law. Just say the wording, Mr. Öcalan. Just say Öcalan. One can be charged with 30 years in prison. So freedom of speech, yeah? Öcalan is a symbol of the Kurdistan movement, and the government doesn't want courts as part of political life. Also, they said that during 2018 and 2019, relatives and families were investigated. 80 mothers, 80, were put in jail for 4 years for sending money to inmates. So they say that the only solution is the release of Öcalan. So the conclusions are clear. Serious violations of human rights happen in Turkey against Öcalan and Kurdish people. Freedom of speech, political rights, freedom of assembly, well, a large list. We won't take the advantage of Council of Europe summit here in Reykjavík to call for a peaceful political negotiation between Turkish authorities and Kurdish movement. And for doing so, it is paramount the release of Öcalan from Imrali prison and let him lead the negotiation on behalf of Kurdish party. It is necessary that the Council of Europe be involved in this peace process. And action is needed now. And we declare to the Council of Europe and its organisms that neutrality in front of violations of rights and freedoms is equivalent to backing the perpetrator. So restart the peace process. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, dear Ögmundur and Denis and also Laura for all these speeches and a very good assessment of the situation for the Kurdish people in Kurdistan and also in Turkey. Now, Ögmundur talked a little bit about the books. I also do encourage you to have a look at them. You may not know, but Öcalan has written more than 60 books throughout his life, and 13 of them have been written from prison as defenses to various courts, because as you can see from what has been expressed here today, his jailers don't really allow him to write any books, actually. So they are defenses to the various courts of human rights. Now, I want to give a little bit more of a context. You may know that the Kurdish people are a community whose homeland has been divided and colonized across 4 states in the nation-state making of the 20th century in the Middle East. Abdullah Öcalan is a key leader who has struggled for the freedom of the Kurdish people, who had long been forgotten in the world. On 9th of October 1998, Abdullah Öcalan was forced out of Syria. In order to find a political and peaceful solution to the Kurdish question, he chose to come to Europe and not to the mountains of Kurdistan. He was actually very hopeful of the European democracy. Now, the Council of Europe was one such institution that many people put their hopes into. Founded in the aftermath of the Second World War, the aim was to ensure that no state fell into fascism ever again, and that through this institution, human rights and the rule of law would be upheld. Today, though, the Council of Europe is holding a summit here in Reykjavík, and we must remind the founding states of the Council of Europe of its founding principles. Fascism is on the rise everywhere in Europe, not least in Turkey. In 1999, instead of facilitating a solution to the Kurdish question, European states and institutions handed Abdullah Öcalan to the Turkish state in a NATO operation that would not incriminate European states in any way. He was forced to Kenya, from where handing him over to Turkey would pose no legal problems to any state, not to Greece, not to Italy, not to Russia, not to any European institution, to no one. European political bodies were not ready to resolve the Kurdish question, neither peacefully, nor politically or legally. Abdullah Öcalan was handed over to a state that denied and actively blacked out the history of a people with a drive to exterminate them for the most part of the history of modern Turkey. Abdullah Öcalan symbolizes what has befallen the Kurdish people. What has happened to the Kurdish people is symbolized in what is happening to Abdullah Öcalan. We invite the Council of Europe to return to its founding principles, as there are no winning sides in wars and fascism. We invite the Council of Europe to embrace its own convention and apply it to all peoples. At the centennial of the Turkish Republic, the Council of Europe should provide assistance to Turkey for a smooth transition to democracy. The only way to do that is to recognize the diversity of peoples and their coexistence in Turkey. The Kurds are one such people. However, when there actually were talks for resolving the Kurdish questions, these talks have not been supported by any European institution, including the Council of Europe. Instead, there is complete silence on the excessive militarization of Turkey, the Turkish occupation of parts of Syria, both Kurdish regions and non-Kurdish regions, and the brutally ethnically cleansing the Kurdish city of Afrin in Rojava in Syria. Turkey has established more than 40 military bases in the area of the Kurdistan regional government in Iraq, is keeping Kurds under existential threat in Turkey and Syria, and its leaders in thousands in prison. On this, again, total silence from the organs of the Council of Europe. Abdullah Öcalan has been incarcerated on an island prison called the İmralı prison that you may know from the film Midnight Express. This island was turned into a military zone when he was brought in February 1999. Öcalan was the only prisoner there until 2009. At the moment, there are 4 prisoners. All of them are political prisoners. And as my friends have also mentioned, that we have not heard from them at all for over 2 years. Not a single word. Now, there are no lack of visits by the CPT, which is the Committee for the Prevention of Torture. In fact, it has visited the island 9 times. It's a record number of visits, in fact. But it seems that these visits are perhaps only to please the Kurds, only to make sure that Kurds are not frustrated, because they have not helped to change the conditions in the island prison. On the contrary, the Turkish state has become bolder in tightening its isolation regime. Unfortunately, the European Court of Human Rights has also not delivered the most progressive judgments in the scores of cases brought before it by the Kurdish people, with their very high hope that their voices will be heard. Instead, over and over again, various Turkish regimes have found yet another strain of legitimation for themselves and what they are doing to the Kurdish people. The court is yet to deliver a judgment whether there has been isolation in the İmralı prison for the past 12 years. The case is still pending. Not only is there isolation, there is also no transparency, because the prisoners are totally and completely cut off from the rest of the world. No information whatsoever is getting out. So what is the court waiting for? One issue the court has ruled is on the aggravated life sentence, which is in fact the death penalty in disguise. They did this not without showing a way to the Turkish government on how to comply with the court's judgment. They told Turkey to create a review mechanism. They did not have to release Öcalan, but they only needed to create a mechanism to review his situation. This in itself is scandalous already. Even worse is that the Turkish government is not even doing this to keep up appearances. I would like to remind all the officials of the Council of Europe that İmralı Island is a prison under their authority as well, and not only under Turkish authority. It's a black hole in the European Convention on Human Rights, right in the heart of Europe, not so far away. Turkey has legitimized attacks on the rights of Kurdish people through this very institution of the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe cannot allow this any further if it wants to retain its credibility. The international initiative Freedom for Abdullah Öcalan, Peace in Kurdistan, has been working in the corridors of the Council of Europe since 2005 in order to make sure that the European Convention can be applied to the Kurdish people and to Abdullah Öcalan. We are convinced that there cannot be any exemptions and/or exceptions to the rule and to the convention. I wholeheartedly agree that the situation here must be the freedom of Abdullah Öcalan and resolution of the Kurdish question with a transition to democracy in Turkey, and that Council of Europe must put all its weight behind this process to achieve a successful conclusion. But there are other ways that the Council of Europe can act. The Council's Anti-Torture Committee, CPT, as I mentioned, has visited the island 9 times since 1999. It has, in its numerous reports, we only do not have the last report yet, criticized the imprisonment conditions and has made recommendations. The response of the Turkish government has been to steadily worsen the conditions contrary to recommendation. The court in Strasbourg is yet to give a verdict on the 12-year-old isolation case. While this is the case, the president of the court, it's so unfortunate for me to say that he is unfortunately from Iceland, he received an honorary degree from a university close to the Turkish government. We ask the Council of Europe that such foul play should not be tolerated, and it taints the court's reputation. But of course, Iceland is not remembered by him, but by Ögmundur and many great friends that we have here in Iceland. The Parliamentary Assembly, PACE, has left this unacceptable situation totally to the court and the CPT. For 24 years, the PACE has not followed up the ongoing violations or indeed whether the recommendations are implemented. This cat and mouse game must be stopped and responsibility must be resumed. The Committee of Ministers is turning a blind eye to Turkey's inaction on the court's 2014 judgment against the aggravated life sentence and stalling a meaningful response. So what needs to be done? We recommend that PACE, which is the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, forms an ad hoc committee so that the severe violations and the isolation regime of Abdullah Öcalan can be investigated. The CPT must use council mechanisms to make sure that its recommendations are implemented and raise alarm for recommendations not being implemented for the last 24 years. The Legal Affairs Committee should step in and monitor the implementations of the CPT recommendations. Turkey's violations of the Convention must be prevented. It opens to the pathway for such abuser states to follow suit. The Secretary General, the Committee of Ministers, and the President of the Assembly must act to stop the reintroduction of the death penalty through the back door in the form of aggravated life sentence. Thank you for listening and thanks for your patience.
Thank you very much, Havin. I mention again the books, the leaflets you are free to take. There are some a collection of quotations from our visit to Turkey, and there is this fact sheet on İmralı Island prison in Turkey. The meeting is now coming to a close. It is evident that Turkey does not fear the international institutions as it should do. It fears its own people. It fears the Kurds because oppressors fear the oppressed. So if we stop oppression, there are no oppressed people and there is nothing to be feared. And this is what we are asking for. Renewal of the peace process we saw in the years 2013 to 2015. But thank you very much for coming, for wanting to hear our messages. We are conveying from Turkey, from the people we met there, and for showing solidarity with human rights. If people want to place questions, please do that after the meeting, because the meeting has now come to a close. Thank you.